Okay, hi everyone. So it's past, so I'm going to make a start. I've done this presentation once already to sort of fill in for somebody who couldn't make it. I've done this about 3 times now, practicing twice and doing it live once, and it's been a different time for each one. So I will stick to my half an hour though. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about something I've been kicking around sort of mentally for a little while, and particularly reflecting on my experience of teaching during my career in librarianship, and now that I've moved on the academic side of things, and what sort of difference that means in terms of my habits in teaching. My presentation is about a concept called lies to children, and I want to think about that in relation to complexity in teaching and then the ethics and logistics that are in play when we are doing library teaching. My name is Darren Flynn. I'm a lecturer in library and information studies at University College London, but previous to that, I worked in libraries for I think about 13 or 14 years, primarily in teaching related roles and working in information literacy teaching. Just in terms of what I'm planning on covering today is I want to first outline the Lies to Children concept, what it means and sort of where it comes from. I want to discuss a little bit about the lies that we tell when we're doing librarian teaching, and also think about that in relation to the context of most librarian teaching that we do. And then thinking particularly about critical library practice or critical information literacy, and hopefully give you some potential resolutions for how we can work through some of the issues that I raise. First of all, what I'd like to do though is just think about this concept of lies to children. So let's start by looking at some of our own educational experiences. So I've displayed a diagram that might be familiar to you. You'd find it in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different textbooks. Um, Anyone in the chat want to just add in what this diagram represents and what the diagram means, I guess? There isn't a wrong answer here, by the way. Yeah, yeah, we've got the answer right there. It's an atom. So this is a diagram of an atom. In the center, we've got the protons and the neutrons, and then orbiting around it, we've got the electrons. Now, if we're being really precise, and bearing in mind I'm an arts and humanities graduate, we would say that this is a lithium atom because it's got 3 protons, although it seems to have gained a few extra electrons. And if we're being even more exacting, we might call it the Bohr diagram of an atom. Now, if you were to study sort of chemistry or physics at a higher level, you probably wouldn't use a diagram like this. This has been outdated for over 100 years, and it's not really the way that we represent or we think about what an atom looks like. You can't zoom in with a microscope to an atom and you'd see this. It's not really how we conceptualize what an atom is anymore, but it is what most of us are taught in, particularly in high school. Um, if you were to study physics or chemistry in particular at a higher level, you'd actually have to unlearn this in order to learn a new model. So you would move on to a sort of quantum model of what an atom actually looks like and how it operates. So let's look at another example from science as we're taught it in school. So this image is something that would be quite familiar. We might see it on a poster, on a child's bedroom wall, or in a book about the solar system. And it does sort of show some of the key information that we'd want children to learn about the solar system. We've got planets all sort of lined up in the right order. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc. It shows how they orbit the sun. And this one's even sort of updated to show that Pluto has been sort of relegated as a planet. But also, this diagram is completely wrong, almost to the point of being imaginary. The orbits that are shown are essentially circular, instead of being elliptical. The scales are massively incorrect in this diagram, both relative, the distance relative to the sun, and also the relative size of each of the planets and each of the planets to the sun. In order to sort of accurately represent the solar system, to scale, you would need an enormous wall that's completely blank with the sun in the center, and almost everything else would be pinprick sized. So although this sort of diagram sort of illustrates some of the basic information we want to get across, it doesn't nearly accurately describe what the solar system actually looks like, how it works, how the planets are in relation to each other. We'd need something very different in order to have that in-depth astronomical knowledge. Next one that I've got as an example here is something specific and a general point that I was taught about in biology in school. So I was taught, as I'm sure many other people were, that things like detached or undetached earlobes and the ability to roll your tongue or not being able to roll your tongue is genetic. It's down to a single dominant gene that I inherit from my biological parents. Similarly, I have blonde hair, I have blue eyes, so I was taught that these are a single recessive gene that meant both of my biological parents carried those genes. These various different features were used to sort of illustrate the point that genetics control a lot of the physical features, like my natural hair color, my eye color. And this was then expanded on to talk about how DNA is sort of fixed, it's hardwired, it's unchangeable, and it's a blueprint for who I am and how I look. It also neatly sort of demonstrated this idea of dominant and recessive genes in order to teach about inheritance. Now, firstly, genome studies have demonstrated that none of these features I've just talked about, detached, undetached earlobes, tongue rolling, hair color, eye color, none of them are down to a single gene. And later on, if you study, again, biology at a higher level, you would learn about things like epigenetics and about how environmental and behavioral factors provide these instructions to switch your genes on and off without changing your genetic code. So when we're all taught, oh, identical twins have exactly the same genes, they have exactly the same genome, and they'll have it through life, not strictly accurate because of things like epigenetics. So we were taught one thing, but actually that's oversimplified. It's been used as an example, and the truth is far more complex. I'm going to give you another couple of quick examples just to show how this comes up in other subject areas. So if we're thinking about maths, this works quite well when you're thinking about lies to children, because actually you don't need to progress particularly far in order to see how it comes up. Now, in very, very early maths, sort of early primary school, I was certainly taught that you cannot subtract a larger number from a smaller number. That isn't possible. And actually later on, you learn about negative numbers and you learn that actually, yes, you can. You just need to have knowledge of negative numbers. Similarly, I was taught when I was first learning division that the answer to a sum like 12 divided by 5 was 2 remainder 2. And that was the correct answer. Now that's taught as being correct, and later on you have to replace that when you learn about decimal places, because that gives you a more accurate but a more complex answer. And lastly in maths, and this is one which even at the time really frustrated me, I was taught that multiplication is repeated addition. So 4 times 3, you work it out by doing 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3. And this works fine for basic timetables and whole numbers, but it really begins to fall apart when you start learning about multiplying negative numbers or multiplying fractions. The last area I want to just mention is in phonics. So phonics is often close to a lot of our hearts because it's about how a lot of children are taught how to read. Not universally used, but it was when I was a child. Now in phonics, you're taught first the sounds of each letter. So a, b, k, d, etc. Then you're taught you need to put them together in order to make a word. So cat is k, a, t, cat. And But then later on, when you're learning to read and learning to sort of speak, you start coming across other words that you cannot pronounce, or you make mistakes when you're pronouncing it. And then you learn that different vowels can have different sounds, that different letters, when they're combined together, will make a different sound. You'll learn about some words have silent letters in them. And this phonics approach that you were taught as being the way that you read suddenly falls apart. And you have to start learning by trial and error and by recognizing patterns. So if there's any sort of non-British people in the audience, I would invite you to have a go sort of phonetically in the chat of thinking about how you would pronounce some of these place names in England, because England and Wales, because they're always really good fun to have a go at. Okay. So what I've been doing here, I've been giving examples of what Terry Pratchett, Stewart and Cohen called a lie to children. So they define a lie to children as being a statement that is false, but which nevertheless leads the child's mind towards a more accurate explanation, one that the child will only be able to appreciate after it has been primed with the lie. So Pratchett introduced this in a book called Science of Discworld. And they didn't invent the concept, but what they did do is sort of coin the phrase. Really, this sort of concept has been around for generations. And arguably, if you apply it to sort of metaphorical or allegorical stories, it's been around for millennia. But this sort of neat term that they give does really kind of express what a lot of education is. So when we're teaching, it's natural to want to simplify the ideas to an appropriate level for the learner. And when we do so, we often knowingly impart information that we know is inaccurate. Now, the term lie is often used sort of wholly negatively, but within this context, the sort of lie has the purpose of explaining the basics in a digestible way and giving the learner the amount of information that they need for their context. So if you want children to learn about what an atom is and what the parts of an atom are, starting out from the point of view of sort of quantum mechanics and that electrons exist in a cloud of probability is not going to be very useful. You need a simpler model, even though you know that to be inaccurate. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the time, later study means that a lot of this knowledge has to be sort of unlearned in order to replace that with a more complex information which is closer to the truth. So it's very common, if you've ever supported as a librarian physics or chemistry students, science students in particular, it comes up, is that their first sort of year of university is often having to unteach everything that they've been told up until that point, and basically starting off by saying everything you've learned before is wrong, but here's something that's more accurate. So does this sort of concept of lies to children ever come up in library instruction? So if you want to share in the chat, have a think if there's any times when you've been teaching students as a librarian or as a library worker, anything which you know to be untrue because you've simplified it so much. And it might be because of time, it might be that you're in a rush, it might be that you don't want to bombard them with complexity. But if you've had experiences like me, I've often said things which I know are strictly speaking not quite true when I'm teaching. So if anyone wants to share this in the chat, please feel free. I'm going to talk to you about some of the sort of lies that I've told when I'm teaching. So first of all, I definitely, when I've been teaching in the library, said things like peer review ensures quality. That's what peer review for. It's a sign of quality and it means it's a quality study. Now, I know that to be inaccurate. Peer review does not guarantee quality. Mistakes make its way through. It might be a marker, but it's certainly not the be all and end all. But I will have said it at some point. I've also talked to people about when they're planning assignments about including a range of perspectives. And again, not completely inaccurate, but very oversimplified because actually putting all perspectives forward, well, that gives equivalence to every different idea on a topic. And actually, some might not necessarily sort of warrant inclusion. And there are certain debates where, it is fairly settled. I've also definitely taught students about the sort of route that you take when you're writing a paper. So first you do your research, then you come up with your arguments, then you write them up, and then you cite your sources as you're going along, as though that sort of research and writing process is very organized, it's very strict, it's very linear. I know, and I know from my own writing, that is not always the case. Often you start off from the point of view of you know the point that you want to make, you know it to be accurate, but you might need to find a source that will back you up on it. Often we go backwards and forwards and we change our arguments. We have to go back and do more research as we start writing. It's messier than that. I've also said things like your tutors will expect a range of sources in your bibliography, which is true. They probably will expect a bit of a range, but I almost guarantee that range is mostly down to sort of academic sources, and they're not going to be super happy if that sort of balance is off. I was a health librarian for a long time. I've talked about things like hierarchies of evidence. And in that, we talk about how studies get more reliable the higher up on the hierarchy they are. Again, deeply oversimplified in terms of what's actually happening in that. And certain study types will be better for certain types of question. I've made throwaway comments like XYZ isn't a trustworthy source. And again, that's oversimplified to me, the point of being untrue. Yes, we might not trust it for some things, but we might for others. And I've also said things like you need the most up-to-date information, or you always want to go for the most recent when you've got a choice, things like that. And again, it oversimplifies things. It's not necessarily the most up-to-date, it's the most relevant, it's the most trustworthy, it's more complex. So what's the problem with these lies to children? Now, when we're using a lie to children in sort of general education, they often work quite well. Now, there's some discomfort or frustration from the learner as they have to experience that unlearning process and get told that everything you were doing and getting marks for is wrong, but this is the right way. But it usually works in practice. And if you're doing sort of science education, it does actually replicate that process of rejecting a hypothesis when you learn more information. And on a broader level, most of us don't really need to understand things like quantum mechanics and epigenetics. The basic level of understanding, even if it's not quite accurate, is usually enough. But there are particular problems when it comes to library instruction. Most library instruction still is one shot, it's time limited, it's arguably more based on procedures rather than concepts, and it's often decontextualized from the research and the writing process. So often we feel forced to sort of stop at the point of the lie. You're expected to write an academic style, but we're not able to go forward into the more sort of complex stuff. And this is a particular problem when we're looking at sort of critical practice, critical pedagogy, critical information literacy, because by its very nature, being critical is usually being more complex because we're trying to look at underlying power dynamics and inequalities. It's much easier to leave it at the lie, and it's much more time consuming and difficult to go into the complex closer to the truth of things. And that often means that it's a real struggle to be a critical library teacher. So how can we sort of navigate some of these problems? Now, I would suggest that, first of all, it's quite useful to sort of delineate between the types of lies that we're telling. So is it a lie of commission where we are knowingly telling an untruth, or is it a lie of omission in terms of we're withholding some information? Now, I would argue that in this context, morally and sort of ethically, a lie of omission is more tolerable for us. Because you're sort of withholding a complexity to tell the lie to children. Now, secondly, I'd suggest it'd be much more useful if, when we're thinking about how we teach, if we were more clear about what ethical frameworks we use. So I work at University College London, so I'm sort of contractually obliged to mention Jeremy Bentham because it's his spiritual and his now literal home. He's still there. But we also remember him for utilitarianism, the idea that ethics is about delivering the greatest good for the greatest number at a very basic level. Deontology is about recognizing moral duties, what moral duties and rules apply to us. And virtue ethics focuses on what helps us develop as moral and ethical and virtuous people. Now, arguing which of these can best apply to a teaching context is way longer than I have in this presentation, but I would suggest that reflecting on what our ethical framework is when we're teaching is a really useful way of thinking about how we go about that. And finally, I'd suggest that we can look at our teaching through the sort of lens of radical transparency. So this is the idea that we should be radically open and honest in our decision making, in our communications, and in our content. So this is something that I adopted quite a lot in my teaching, which is if we're teaching something which we know to be simplified to the point of veering into untruth, we can say so and we can explain why we're doing that. So to explain that I've oversimplified this, it's more complicated than that, but this is what I can tell you right now, or this is what I have time to tell you within this session. And doing so invites people to look into the deeper, more complex truths behind the lie. I would also suggest that there's some sort of like practical ways that we can get around these problems as well. I think it's all very well raising problems like these, but the practical and logistical problems that we have in library teaching aren't going away. Much as we'd love to have, our own courses where we can teach this over weeks and months and really develop people's critical library knowledge, realistically, most of us are never going to have that. We're usually still stuck with limited contact with students and working within assessments and with academics that have got very fixed and often oversimplified expectations of what we're going to cover. And it isn't going to help the students that much if you spend your 1 hour a year with them covering all the problems with peer review, if their tutors are still going to expect them to only cite from peer-reviewed articles. Moreover, I do think it's important to think that critical library teaching should be liberatory. It should be something that we want to engage with. We shouldn't be using it as a cudgel to sort of hit us over the head and make us feel bad about ourselves. So I wanted to suggest a few steps that we can take that are sort of practical ways of getting around this. So first of all, I would suggest looking at a concept called differentiation in teaching. Now, differentiation has got a bit of a bad reputation in higher education. It's a bit of a dirty word, but it is used a lot in primary and secondary teaching. This means that you look at what students already know and you seek to build on that and expand their knowledge. And that can be on an individual level. So if we are teaching a class about peer review, we can look at what students already know. And if you know that there are some students that have got a basic understanding, even if it's one of those lies, then we can look at building on that and saying, actually, it's more complex than that and introducing that greater complexity so that some students that are ready can move beyond the lie into something more complex and maybe more truthful. I would also suggest that we should more often in our teaching embrace complexity and communicate complexity. I've often found that there's a sort of habit and an approach in library teaching that shies away from complexity, that we want to break everything down into sort of tiny digestible chunks and takeaways and checklists and neat models that look nice on the screen. And actually, sometimes I think it'd be much better if we do explain that these things are complicated and frame our teaching as being and covering the amount of complexity that I can within the time that we've got. and also look at things like working with academic staff, what their goals and agendas are. So if they are saying that they're interested in decolonising or diversifying the curriculum offering, then looking at what we can do towards that. And it might often be that that session that I've been delivering for the last 5 years from you about database searching, you say you want to diversify the curriculum. Well, let's look at some alternative ones rather than these big databases that we always use that have such a Western bias. Or maybe looking at different ways of students expressing themselves, that it doesn't have to be stuck within a rigid referencing style, which can disadvantage some students and isn't very equitable to global authors. Finally, I'd look at creating sort of creative alternative curriculums as well. So you probably can't fit any more than you already have in the sessions that you've got, but we can look at what happens outside the classroom and signpost it within the classroom. So if we're introducing something that's being oversimplified, we can then say to students, this is the oversimplified version that I can cover with you today, but here's some alternative points of view that you can look at in your own time, and that will give you a different perspective. Now, it might only be 10% of students that ever do that, but that's 10% of students that have now learned something new, critical, and interesting that they didn't have before. Thank you. I think I'm done there. Is there anyone? I haven't been able to look at the chat as we've gone along, but I might have time for maybe one question. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll set it so that you can unmute yourselves. Liz, go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, I really loved this session. Thank you so much. So my question in the chat is, practically speaking, how would you differentiate your teaching in a classroom, that maybe half the class knew a basic concept and half the class was ready for it? I don't know if you've done this before, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. So I should say so where I learned to teach, I was in a teaching librarian role, but I was in secondary education. So I was working with younger children rather than university students. There are lots of different ways that you can differentiate. The sort of classic path that you take is to do some sort of pre-assessment at the start of a class. So checking what knowledge people already have. So that might be a very simple multiple choice quiz. Then you have activities which are set at either different levels of complexity, or it might be that they've got a different focus, or it might be that they've got a different output that you want to do. So you differentiate by content, or differentiate by task, or differentiate by outcome. What you can then do if you want to complete the cycle is you can do an assessment for learning at the end, and that sees where people are at now. Now, in a university setting, that's really difficult because it's not encouraged to sort of separate by task or separate by ability level. So one approach I've done within the past is to do a sort of self-marking quiz. And what that might do at the end is to direct people towards a certain activity. So I might have there's 4 activities that I put on the board with a video and something to do, and then say you might want to do activity 1, 2, 3, or 4. But ultimately, you're giving people that choice. Now, the nice thing with that as well is if you've got some pre-recorded activities that people can do, what you can then do is make them all available afterwards. So you can say to people afterwards, right, if you didn't do number 2, you might want to do that after the class. And that just means that everyone's getting the same input, but within the class, you're able to sort of steer people at the level of complexity that they may be ready for.